Hello everybody and welcome to the Dry Dock episode 173. This week, the questions are taken from the 5-minute guide to the Garibaldi class, that's guide 226, and also from the first video in the series that I've done so far on the Swedish ship Vasa. This one is From Concept to Maiden Voyage, part 1. So, let's begin. Federico del Sarto asks, which navy had the best pre-dreadnought designs? It's actually very difficult to quantify because, apart from right at the end, there's actually a very significant amount of conformity of design when it comes to pre-dreadnoughts. Certainly a lot more than you'd see before them in the Ironclad era, or indeed after them in the Dreadnought era. One of the sort of defining characteristics of pre-dreadnoughts is 12-inch guns, plus or minus an inch, in a pair of twin turrets, one fore, one aft, a bunch of secondary, tertiary, etc. guns, and triple expansion engines. And as a result, when you try and compare the main batteries, you can point to a few where the main battery is probably not quite as brilliant, such as some of the early German pre-dreadnoughts where they stuck 9.4-inch guns on. Now, admittedly, there were reasons why they did that. It just so happened that those reasons didn't actually really pan out as working in reality. And you can point to others like some of the French pre-dreadnoughts with the pronounced tumble home and some of the designs they exported to Russia, which have hilariously poor stability once they take any kind of damage. Bouvet in World War I kind of proving the point for that one if Tsushima hadn't done so already. So whilst it's easy to pick out the ones that are, shall we say, not so brilliant, the US Navy's idea of welding an 8-inch gun house on top of their main battery, also not necessarily the best most well thought out of plans, nor indeed the Canopus class deciding to have a 6-inch armor belt. That's not exactly a good idea, a little bit short-sighted there, but as I say, it's easy to point out the negatives, but when it comes to the positives, as you say, the best designs, they're kind of all close-ish to each other. They're all speed-wise, once you get to the good ones, around about 18 knots, plus or minus a knot or two. They're all got similar-ish armor. They all have very similar firepower. You'd basically be trying to draw very, very, very fine distinctions between usually the quality of the secondary batteries, because without centralized direct-to-fire control, the fact that one gun or another might have a bit more range doesn't really make much odds, because they've all got the range to hit each other with. Where you start to see some divergence, and where you probably could make an assessment, is in the very last pre-dreadnoughts, because then you start to see a slight abandonment of the classic pre-dreadnought design principles. You start to see either more numerous or heavier secondary batteries and so forth. But even then, it becomes quite difficult to actually quantify who did what better. For example, you might compare the Danton class and the Lord Nelson class, two of the more latterly finished pre-dreadnoughts. And in both cases, they've seriously upped the ante on the secondary batteries. The Lord Nelson's using 10 9.2-inch guns, the Danton's using 12 9.4-inch guns. So there's a lot of firepower there compared to the 6-inch or thereabouts guns that a lot of previous pre-dreadnoughts have. And it has sometimes been said that, the Dantons probably stood a reasonable chance against some of the early dreadnoughts as long as they could engage them at fairly close range, where the slight lack of armor penetration of the 9.4 compared to the 12-inch gun wouldn't make as much odds. But then you also have to take into account the fact the Dantons were built much later than pretty much any other pre-dreadnought. So they have the advantage of a couple of years' technological advancement in an era where technology was advancing very quickly. You also have the fact that whilst they have an extra gun, and the 9.4s are probably slightly more powerful than the 9.2s, the Dantons have a bit less armor protection than a Lord Nelson. But they are slightly faster. And would the armor actually make that much of a difference at that kind of close range? Would it maybe protect them if they were getting to the close range? Would having those big secondary batteries actually possibly be a hindrance because it might confuse the main gunners? Would the ship possibly be overwhelmed, sort of Borodino style at Tsushima, by something like a Braunschweig with well over a dozen 6.7-inch guns? All of this is, to a certain extent, up to a lot of interpretation. So if you pick your preferred characteristics for a pre-dreadnought and the kind of engagement you want it to fight, then yes, it's probably relatively easy to narrow down to a specific pre-dreadnought, say, right, this is the best for how I want to fight. But the simple fact that pre-dreadnoughts could fight in so many different ways, would be fought in so many different ways, and, some of the theories under which some of them were constructed ended up not being tested in real-life combat, I think it makes it very difficult to judge specifically which one is the absolute best from the general pack. War Daddy Industries asks, why go through the trouble of raising a sunken ship just to shoot it? I understand the importance of training, but wouldn't a nice patch of jungle work? Because generally, if you are shooting at a target ship, then you are trying to analyse an awful lot more than just can your gunners hit the target. It will also be about what effect are our shells having on the target in question, at which point, using an armoured ship, which you can then analyse, see how the shells went this far into the ship, they deflected off this amount of armour stopped them, this amount of armour didn't stop them, the fragments scattered in the following manner, all that kind of stuff. You need a realistic target, and if you have a ship, then you don't mind expending it, then that is the best target to shoot at. You won't get any of that data if you shoot at a patch of jungle. Also, you can, if you're using an expendable target ship, you can make it move, which means it's a slightly more realistic environment than just a static patch of something that you're shooting at. And as for why you'd refloat it once you've sunk it, well, you'll have that ship already pre-set up for being shot at. So if you've got experimental fit outs of maybe you've doubled up the armor to see how an increased thickness of armor would work out. So you might be expending a cruiser, but you've armored a portion of it to resemble your latest battleship design. Well, you want to obviously check out how that's performed. That's best done by getting the thing back up to the surface. Hopefully you've had the good sense of ensuring that you shot at the ship in relatively shallow water so that it's relatively easy to get back up again. And, once you've refloated it, well, you might as well use it again. It's going to be cheaper to patch up and shoot it and sink it again and then reanalyze it than it is to fit out a whole other ship. Plus also you'd have a very inconvenient wreck most of the time to get rid of. So weirdly enough, when you are looking at not just can we hit a thing, but also what is the effect on the thing that we hit, sinking and re-raising and sinking and re-raising and sinking and re-raising the same target ship in shallow water actually makes an awful lot of sense. Philip Carl Agonia asks, how do you rank Super Dreadnought classes from their quality to their effectiveness both on paper and in practice? This is something that, again, requires, kind of like the pre-Dreadnought question, a lot of qualifiers. For a start, what do you class as a Super Dreadnought? Because obviously you've got Dreadnoughts, 12-inch or 11-inch guns. You then have the classic and original definition of Super Dreadnoughts, which is ships with 13.5 or 14-inch or thereabouts weapons, maybe 13.4s as well. And then you kind of have this awkward bit where you've got things that are armed with 15-inch and maybe even 16-inch weapons, which often get looped into Super Dreadnoughts, but not always, because they're not fast battleships. So we're talking about things like the Queen Elizabeths, Revengers, Bardens, Nagato, Colorado, Nelson, etc. Some or all of those will quite often get lumped into Super Dreadnoughts. Others will draw the line and say, actually, Nelson, Colorado, Nagato, they are the first treaty era battleships, but not fast battleships, so we're splitting them off to be their own thing, which at that point basically leaves you, if once you're looking at ships above 14-inch guns with Queen Elizabeth, Baden, and Revenge, maybe Hood as well, and sometimes they will be included as super dreadnoughts, and sometimes they won't be, because at the time they kind of were distinguished. The super dreadnoughts, especially in the UK, were seen as the 13.5-inch gunships, the Orions, King George V's, and Iron Dukes, and then the Queen Elizabeths were the next step beyond the super dreadnought. It's just that, hyper dreadnought or ultra dreadnought or super duper dreadnought all sounds a bit stupid, so no one really called them that, but they were perceived to be the step above. So if you go by the strict definition of super dreadnought, i.e. not including the QEs, Revengers and Bardens, then on the British side you've got the Orions, King George V's, and Iron Dukes. For the Americans, you have the New Yorks, the Nevadas, the Pennsylvanias, the New Mexicos, the Tennessees. The Japanese obviously have the Fuso and Issei classes. The Germans don't have anything under the strict definition. Neither do the Italians, because they didn't finish the Caracciolos, and those wouldn't fall into that category anyway. The Spanish likewise, and the French get the Britannias. Now, in that context, when you combine on-paper effectiveness with what they accomplished in service, unfortunately the Britannias come pretty low on that list because, well, they didn't do all that much compared to everybody else's ships. Granted, they did survive into the Second World War, whereas some of them, especially all the British 13.5-inch ships, didn't in an active service role. But accomplishment-wise, there's precious little other than, Britannia exploded when Hood shot at it. They've got the smallest guns, okay, but their overall design does leave a fair bit to be desired. And then at the other end of things, you have, well, basically thanks to the fact that the last ships in the category to be built, the Isseis and the Tennessees, kind of fighting out for top spot. The Iron Dukes are pretty good, but they're also 5 years or so behind the Tennessees and the Isseis when it comes to when they're finally commissioned into the fleet. So, that's a fairly big gap technologically, especially for the 1910s. And then you can argue that sort of the back and forth with the Isseis have a slight speed advantage, but they're not as well protected. They both got them and the Tennessees have the same number of guns, but the Tennessees have them concentrated in triple turrets, whereas the Isseis have them distributed, which gives them technically more survivability per turret hit, but means there's more turrets to be hit. Personally, I would favour the Tennessees in the strict category of super dreadnoughts as probably the most effective on paper, and they saw some pretty good service across, World War II mostly. They were kind of ish around maybe for the very end of the First World War. At least they were on the stocks, but yeah. But yeah, so and to be honest, in a large part, apart from some of the technological issues around the Britannias, most of how you would chart effectiveness for super dreadnoughts under the strict categorization is almost a linear progression of age, because obviously the Orions, the original ones, they lead to the King George V's, which are better, which lead to the Iron Dukes, which are better still. And the same with the US, the Nevadas are more effective than the New Yorks, the Pennsylvanias are more effective than the Nevadas, and so on and so forth. But if you kind of broaden the category to include anything that's got a gun bigger than 12-inch, built before the Colorado, Nagato, and Nelson classes are laid down, so you include the 15-inch ships, effectively, then at that point you probably want the QEs, because they have that little bit of extra speed advantage that gives them the ability to be kind of frontline combatants in World War I, whereas none of the other super dreadnoughts really are. And also, they have the 15-inch 42 gun, they have pretty decent armor layouts, and they also have significant capability to be modernized, as QE, Valiant, and Warspite proved. And of course, especially with Warspite, they've kind of run away with the effectiveness in practice prize. But when you go down to who gets second place, it can get to be a very, very stiff competition, because you still have the ones that scored top in the basic categorization, the strict categorization. But, even then, you compare a Revenge to a Tennessee, for example, and it can get a little bit interesting because the Revenge has better guns, but the Tennessee has 4 more guns. The Revenge has a slightly higher speed, at least from new. They're 2 knots faster. They're both fairly heavily armoured, but the overall differences, once everything evens out, are actually quite marginal. Granted, okay, most US 14-inch turrets do have dispersion problems early on, but that's an issue that can be fixed. So when you're looking at kind of when they're all in service in the 1920s, picking your combat effectiveness between a Tennessee and a Revenge, it's an interesting conundrum. It comes down to which factors do you personally favour when it comes to combat effectiveness. As I say, do you value the speed and the slightly increased hitting power per gun, or do you value fractionally thicker armour? And I do mean fractionally, talking like half an inch, and the fact you have more guns to shoot at the enemy. So it can get a bit dicey there. But yeah, the QEs, if you include the broader category, come out quite comfortably on the top. And unfortunately, that doesn't change anything for the poor old Britannia stuck down there at the bottom. David and Martine Alban ask, what happens if a ship, preferably talking about a capital ship, fails its sea trials? And what would the outcome or reaction to a ship failing its sea trials be? And would it be different between the lead ship of a class and the subsequent ship of the same class? Well, to outright fail your sea trials, that requires something rather spectacular to go wrong, because the whole point of sea trials is to find out what goes wrong, and then come back and fix it. It's expected that things will break, things will go wrong, things will malfunction, other things might overperform, and that in and of itself might break something else that's otherwise performing perfectly adequately. If you end up in a situation where a ship goes through all its sea trials and nothing breaks, then you should start to get very suspicious. Because it means either you've somehow been given the world's most perfect ship, and let's face it, your luck probably isn't that good, or someone's been fudging the data, or something has yet to go wrong but is going to go catastrophically wrong in the future. It just hasn't happened yet. But I suppose, yeah, it is possible and has happened on occasion where a ship has outright failed at sea trials, and that's where something has broken to a point that it's completely irreparable, i.e. it's not something that's been overstressed or overstrained or deliberately run up against its limits. It's just in the normal course of operations, this thing should have functioned perfectly normally. It hasn't. It's effectively self-cannibalized in a rather dramatic fashion, and there is no way on earth that thing was ever going to work or will ever work if we replace it like for like. And it has to be a significant part of the ship system. So, I don't know, the boilers packing up, or the turbines self-destructing, or, I don't know, somebody decided it was a good idea to put turrets on with a screw thread, so one of them did a couple of rotations and fell over the side of the ship. That kind of thing would be, yeah, you've now failed your sea trials because the ship is fundamentally unsound. It cannot be fixed if it's built to the manner in which it was originally designed. Because at that point, what you're saying is, it's not the execution that's the problem, it's the fundamental underlying design of the vessel. If that happens, well, there's going to be a lot of recriminations, because designs for warships generally go through an awful lot of stages with an awful lot of professionals and an awful lot of reviews before you get to the point where it goes on sea trials. So how on earth did they all drop the ball this badly, will be the first question. The second question is, who's going to pay for the potentially millions upon millions upon millions, if you insert local currency here, that have been invested in the ship or ships that are currently either built or under construction? And how many more millions are we going to have to spend to redesign and fix this problem? So nothing good is going to come out of a failed sea trial, other than possibly a bunch of crews being rather grateful that it happened then and not while they're in the middle of combat. But If a ship then failed at sea trials, and it's the lead of the ship, lead ship of the class, as you mentioned, then that's probably going to bring wider recriminations, but potentially also less serious at the same time, because if it's the lead ship of a class, the assumption is probably going to be, unless very significant factors indicate otherwise, that it's a fundamental problem with the design. So everyone will go, okay, right, this thing broke. It's obviously a completely flawed design. Let's go back and work out from the design drawings what went wrong, how do we fix it. There should be, at least to a certain degree, a relatively linear path of figuring these things out. If you have a ship that's somewhere down the line within the production and it fails rather spectacularly in its sea trials, that's when you have to start to get worried, because then people are going to be looking at the first few ships and going, well, they worked, so it's probably not the design in and of itself. So what's different between that ship and this ship, which usually will be built in a different shipyard? At which point some very awkward questions are going to start to be asked from either the shipyard or the suppliers who provided the materials and the labour to build that particular ship. And that could lead to some very big compensation court cases, because at that point it's a case of, well, no, that should have worked. The only reason it doesn't work is because you, specifically, whoever that happens to be, really, really badly screwed things up. And that is not a good place to be in. If you are the person in question or anyone associated with them. And when, as I say to you, that includes the people who are doing quality control checks, because, again, people are saying, well, we had the examples, this one looked like this one looked like this. This one, well, we can see now from what's left of it, it didn't look like this. How did you not catch it? Basic quality control and assessment. So yeah, whilst it wouldn't engender a complete redesign of the vessel itself, the actual fallout in a much more focused area would be considerably worse for a ship partway down the class. James Hill asks, the Garibaldi class, like many contemporary ships, had a hybrid weapon system of both casemate and turret guns. Why do you think the evolutionary process from casemate to turret took so long, when turrets have such an obvious advantage with arcs of fire? What are the pros and cons that were in play between the two systems? The two main things that casemates had going for them over turrets were weight and stability, with a third, slightly less important factor of complexity. Now, the reason for that was, well, if you have a casemate, the casemate gun shield only needs to occupy a certain portion of the forward arc. There's no floor, there's no ceiling. Depending on exactly how wide the casement arc is, there may not even be much, if any, sides, and there's definitely no back to it. All of those are made up by the rest of the ship. Therefore, in terms of dedicated armour per gun, you only have to worry about a much smaller gun shield area, as compared to a turret, which has all of those other things, and therefore you need to armour all of those areas to some degree or other. As I said, there's also the stability element to it. So with casemates, because you can mount them into the hull, you can also mount them lower in the ship. And granted, some people did take that to a little bit too much of an extreme and ended up with them being flooded out and therefore useless. But in theory, the ability to mount a casemate one deck lower means that their overall effect on stability from the weight of what armour you do have to install and the guns themselves will be less than if you have to turret mount the guns, which obviously they weigh more in the first place, and being higher up, they are going to have a cumulatively greater effect on stability that goes beyond just the increased weight. And the same goes for, even if you mount casemate guns a deck higher at the level where you'd expect to mount a turret, because they still weigh less, then they're still having a lesser effect on your overall stability than they would if the same number of turret-mounted weapons. The third factor, which I mentioned, which is somewhat of a lesser one to a certain extent, but is still there, is complexity, because with casemate guns you can have a gallery and one or two shell feeds from magazines, and then obviously run the shells up and down the gallery. Everything's fine, at least until everything catches fire. Whereas with turrets, if they're true turrets, then they will have their own barbettes, which also adds to the weight, and their own shell feed systems, as well as rotational mechanisms, etc., which all add to the complexity of the weapon. In theory, you can also make the argument that casemates give you more firepower because of the weight and stability savings. You can have more casemate guns down the side. Therefore, your broadside is heavier, and the weight of fire you can bring to bear on of the broadside consistently is larger. Obviously, as you mentioned, you've got arcs of fire, which give you more of an advantage with turrets. But turrets do have advantages, as you pointed out. Mainly is the arcs of fire. Secondly is because you have to mount them higher, they also tend to be much clearer of the waves. With turrets, you can also have double or triple turrets. With casemates, well, you can just about make a double casement, but virtually nobody ever did. So you can get salvo fire from secondary turrets. Because they're turrets with their own roofs and everything, you can also get much higher elevation out of secondary turrets, so you can get a much longer range. And they're more survivable, because if you have a casement gallery and something hits it, as Malaya found out at Jutland, that can be quite bad. Whereas, okay, fair enough, hitting a secondary turret is not going to be any good for the people inside that turret, but chances are the nearby turrets might well survive. And as time goes on, then when dual-purpose weapons start to become a thing, turrets are really the only way to go, because turrets, of the two options, the only ones that allow you the elevation necessary to use them as dual-purpose weapons. You're not really going to get a dual-purpose casement anytime soon. Dejan Gabrovsek, I think, asks, how useful were the secondary turrets in the center line, such as on the Yamato or Des Moines class, and why were they so rare? So the reason why they're rare is because normally you don't want your main battery turrets, especially obviously the forward ones, to be any further forward on the ship than they have to be, because there's a lot of weight involved, there's a lot of space and volume involved, and by pushing them more and more forward, you're extending the citadel, which can make things a bit difficult in terms of keeping within a weight limit. You're also, by moving the barbettes closer towards the sides of the hull, because the hull is obviously angling in, you render them slightly more vulnerable to incoming fire. You are also putting a lot of heavy weight on a further end part of the ship, which can cause problems for the hull. So ideally you want the turrets to be as close to the center of your vessel linearly, as well as obviously laterally, as possible. By sticking a secondary turret in there, in most cases, unless you've come up with something dramatic to shorten the superstructure, you are pushing your turrets forward. Or you just have a massive hull where it doesn't actually matter so much, like, say, with the Yamatos. The other problem with them is that if you are going to have the ammunition feed in any way protected, that's going to be a very tall barbette, because it's got to clear at least 2 deck levels so that the turret can actually fire over the main battery turrets. So with all those complications in mind, why would anyone ever do it? Well, the simple factor is that it allows you to technically halve the number of secondary guns you would otherwise need to get the same kind of broadside, because obviously these guns can bear either side as well as ahead and a little bit back, whereas if you're running secondary turrets purely down the wings, then in order to be able to fire port and starboard, you're going to need 2 turrets. This allows you to have 1. Now, that has certain weight savings involved, as well as obviously space savings in terms of the deck. So you effectively have to run an equation of, will I actually save any weight by having a tall barbette with a single turret stuck on it, as compared to 2 wing turrets mounted lower down? And if I am going to save that weight and that deck space, do the other design considerations about possibly having to extend the citadel and relocate my main armament from where I might otherwise want it to be, are those going to outweigh the benefits? And if it does, if those factors do outweigh the benefits you're getting, then you don't do it, which is what most ships ended up doing. But if you have some special circumstance going on, which means that actually the benefits outweigh the negatives, then you gain by doing so, as I say. So you with the Des Moines, you get a pair of 5-inch 38 guns that can bear on any direction. So you can have your wing turrets and supplement those wing turrets with the firepower of this centerline secondary turret, whichever direction the threat happens to be coming from. With the Yamatos, you've got 6.6-inch up there, so that means that as well as initially the fits of 6.6-inch turrets on either side, you can add an entire 6.6-inch to one side, and then you can swivel it around and add an entire 6.6-inch to the other without the weight of having two 6.6s. So, yeah, that's the main benefit of the centerline secondaries, but the equation I just described usually doesn't come up in their favor. The notable thing is when you look at the Yamatos, the Des Moines, and some of the other classes that have these centerline secondaries, almost universally, it's either because they have a somewhat oversized hull for what they are, or because they've managed to play some very interesting games with the overall size and layout of the superstructure. William Kruger asks, at any point in the Age of Sail before the Ironclad era, what was the biggest possible ship of the line? More than 3 decks, more than 4 masts, and so on. Absolute maximum in terms of displacement, physical size, armament, etc. Well, the largest wooden warship by displacement to enter service was this ship, HMS Victoria. She actually had a slightly larger sister ship, HMS Howe, but it wasn't completed in time. You also have things like the French Britannia class ships of the line, not the World War I era super dreadnoughts. And Britannia was about 6 foot longer, about a foot narrower, but displaced about 100 tons less. So you're looking at something in the region of about 260 feet, give or take, about 60 foot beam, again, give or take, depending on exact ship class. That's about as big as the wooden warships actually get for, rated ships of the line. Now, within that, you do have to take into account that these ships had iron reinforcing straps inside them. But the thing is, that had kind of been a thing for several decades at that point, so they're not entirely wood ships, but they do predate the Ironclad, and they really are pushing it as far as, how big you can get them. These ships are carrying about 130 guns, give or take a few. Yes, that's less than Santissima Trinidad, but for one, they're 3-deckers, because, okay, you can probably see from this painting, you could make a certain argument that HMS Victoria is 4-deck. You've got the 170-gun Duke of Kent, which again was never built, but theoretically could have been built. The problem is that 4 fully enclosed gun decks tends to make a ship of the line so slow and unmaneuverable as to not really be worth it. And whilst you have lots of guns, the 4th gun deck will tend to have to be armed with very light guns because of how high up it is. So it's better to have slightly fewer, heavier guns on 3 gun decks than slightly more numerous but lighter guns on 4. You can see the number of masts present on Victoria here, and it's pretty much pushing the upper acceptable limit. You would obviously later on, and even initially beforehand, get longer ships in the form of frigates, but one, they tended not to work very well. They tended to work their way apart quite quickly, and 2, they weren't anywhere nearly as heavily armed because they would have obviously fewer gun decks, narrower beam. They're just kind of long and thin vessels, so it's not big except in just the one dimension. In theory, as with the incomplete HMS Howe, you might be able to go a little bit larger, but to be honest, even with something like a ship of the line, once you go much beyond these kind of dimensions, you're going to be entering the realm of either, like some of the really long frigates, they're going to start working themselves apart, or you are going to end up replacing so much of the internals with iron that you're kind of building a composite ship, not a wooden vessel. An Audible Sabre asks, why was there so much difference in armour for the treaty cruisers? Information on cruiser gun performance is much harder to find than battleship guns, and cruiser armour protection, when it was present, ranges from maybe 3 inches to over 6 inches on the heaviest armoured ships. That's quite a lot of difference in armour against, theoretically, the same 6-inch or 8-inch threat. It comes down to a couple of things. One is, what balance are you putting on your cruiser? And secondly, what era within the treaty era are you running the cruiser from? The latter does actually make a surprising amount of difference. Now, when it comes to the first part, though, what's your balance on the cruiser? Obviously, if you put more guns on, then there's more space and more weight dedicated to armament, and therefore there is commensurately less space and less weight available for your armour, unless you also reduce your machinery and make yourself slower, but not many people wanted to do that. Likewise, if you are going to aim for exceptional speed, then you're going to have to make sacrifices somewhere, either in lessening the number of guns or in lessening the amount of your armour, assuming that everyone's trying to build, at least ostensibly, to 10,000 tons. You can, of course, cheat, but assuming that you're trying to stick somewhere in the region of the 10,000 ton limit, all of these balancing factors apply. So when you look at, say, the Japanese cruisers, they're aiming to have 10 guns. They're putting them in 5 twin turrets, so that's quite a lot of space, quite a lot of weight. They're also trying to get quite fast, so unsurprisingly, their overall armour protection, especially on the turrets, suffers somewhat. You've also obviously got to take into account the weight of secondary batteries, anti-aircraft guns, that kind of thing as well. But the other element that I discussed, once you've discussed your balance, and the final element of that balance, by the way, is also what are you actually armouring against? Because of the difficulty in getting enough armour to withstand 8-inch gunfire on 10,000 tons, some nations just turn around and said, you know what, stuff it, we're just going to have a cruiser that is proof against 6-inch gunfire. If at long range it happens to bounce the odd 8-inch shell, then so be it, but we'd rather have, a faster, more heavily armed ship that's more likely to get the hits in the first place, and thus not need the armour, than sacrifice that speed and hitting capability in exchange for armour that'll protect it, but, once it's being hit, so something's gone wrong already. Very crudely put. Now, when it comes to the technological instances, this is a fairly complex subject, but broadly it comes down to 2 primary factors. There are a lot of secondary ones, but the primary ones are the quality of steel you can produce and the type and quality of machinery you can produce. At the beginning of the 1920s, when the first heavy cruisers like the Pensacolas are being built, machinery simply needs more weight and more volume to give a certain power output. And if you want to get up to a certain speed, let's say 30 knots, it's relatively slow for a heavy cruiser, but let's just go with it, then to get the power output, you need to push a 10,000 ton ship through the water at 30 knots, assuming your hydrodynamics are somewhat good. You're going to need a certain amount of volume and weight for your machinery, irrespective of armament, etc. Whereas in the mid-1930s, that machinery weight and space has gone down quite significantly. So you can then either have more weight available for armour, and indeed weapons, or you can go even faster with the same amount. And if you're quite happy with your speed, then, well, there's more weight available to put into protection. The other element, as I said, is steel quality. And steel quality is quite important, because if your steel can only take up to a certain amount of loading, as compared to someone else's steel that might be a bit better, well, then to withstand a certain load, you will need more steel than the other guy. That steel weighs a certain amount, and therefore, if your basic hull structure is going to come out heavier than the other nations, then you again have less weight to devote to machinery, propulsion, weaponry, and protection in the form of armour. And so usually it's armour that loses out there. As your steel gets more advanced, you can use less of it to build a ship that can take the same loads, and bear in mind the 10,000 ton limit means that loads are probably going to be somewhat in the same region, and therefore, again, you have more weight available. The reason for the picture that's accompanying the background to this question is because the French heavy cruisers are probably the single best example of this. When they start out building heavy cruisers, they build the Duquesnes. The Duquesnes are hilariously badly armoured, to the point that some people basically say they aren't armoured. when it comes to a cruiser fight. And they're pretty much right. Because, weirdly enough, considering France was actually quite advanced when it came to making steel weapons, armour and munitions in the late 19th century, was one of the leaders, by the late 1910s, early 1920s, they were quite a bit behind. And so the Duquesnes had basically used so much relatively low-quality steel in their hull frames that once you'd put a basic 8-inch gun armament on and got them up to a half-decent speed, you basically had nothing left for protection. The French steel industry then, realised, hang on a minute, we're supposed to be ahead of everybody else, sorted themselves out over the late 20s and early 30s, and then along came Algerie, which is built to the same restrictions. It's got, on paper, the same armament, 8-inch guns, albeit they are of a slightly improved model. It now actually has more anti-aircraft guns, because, that had been recognised as a threat. It's still got a very good turn of speed, but it now is one of the best protected. And almost all of the weight that was necessary for Algerie's very good armour protection had basically come from using a higher quality steel to be able to slim down the overall weight of the ship's hull and structure itself. Trevorius asks, on a recent visit to USS Iowa, one of the things that was pointed out to me was a descaling mechanism that used hot steam to clean soot build-up while underway. And my immediate thought was, this seems like something that would have been very beneficial to the High Seas Fleet in World War I. So could you talk a bit about that system, when it was developed, and to what extent, if any, it would have helped the Germans with their bad coal situation? So a soot blower requires, in these kinds of circumstances, a source of high-pressure steam, and this steam would then be sprayed over or inside the boiler tubes, as appropriate, depending on the type of boiler you're using, which would remove the soot. But as you can see here in this picture of a slightly later warship, well, that soot's got to go somewhere, so you end up looking like a Q80 oil field circa 1990 for a little while. So, yeah, don't do that unless you're either sure that absolutely everything downwind of you is clear, or maybe someone you don't particularly like is downwind of you, because there's going to be a lot of muck and grime. Anyway, the systems themselves appear to have been developed initially around about 1910. That's when they start showing up in various manufacturers' literature. However, partly because steam pressure was not as high as it would be in later periods aboard various ships, and partly for various other reasons I'll go into in a minute, the actual installation of soot blowers on warships doesn't really appear to have kicked off until the interwar period. Some newer ships in the 1910s, especially the late 1910s, were installed with them, but in the early to mid 1920s you start to see references in various naval appropriation bills and such like about the installation of soot blowers to the fleet. So that's kind of when they're coming about in a big way in various fleets. Now, partly that's because as technology advances, the source of high-pressure steam that you need is there. You could get soot blowers, as I mentioned beforehand, but they tended to need independent power sources, which just increases complexity and weight, which you don't really want on a warship. But also, almost all soot blowers referred to in any kind of easily available literature are all referring to helping, as with Iowa, to clear out the soot left over by oil. The soot and other residue left over by bad coal is an entirely different matter. With bad coal, you can get some very sticky and nasty residues, which, high pressure hot steam might clear them off, but it's not going to clear them off anywhere near as well as the relatively fine soot that you get from burning oil. And it also will probably just end up re-solidifying further up the line. And when you are burning coal, the other problem is that not only do you get soot and nasty sticky residues, but you get clinker, which is unburned large solids. That stuff, well, hopefully you haven't got it stuck in your boiler tubes, because then you really are in trouble. But that stuff just builds up within the fire grates themselves, within the initial part of the boiler, and it occupies volume, It creates a lot of very nasty soot in and of itself as little bits will get flaked off. And in some respects, it can even burn through the grates because, you know, it will still retain an awful lot of heat, and it'll be a persistent heat source rather than one that's losing some of that energy just to, you know, burning away. So it might have helped a little bit, in as much as clearing out the boiler tubes will overall help. But the build-up of the clinker and the large mass solids and the sticky residues from bad quality coal that were the main things that bedeviled the Germans, a soot-blowing system is not going to help all that much, if at all, with most of those issues. At best, it might give them another half hour to an hour's high-speed steaming, I would estimate, before the other issues that it can't really solve get to a critical point. And in fact, at that point, you might end up having more damage because those other things, like large amounts of hot clinker on the fire grates, might well have then exacerbated their own issues before you draw down the pressure to allow yourself to clean everything up. Goose Riesbos asks, was there any talk between the Pacific and Atlantic theatres in regards to submarine warfare? Like, did Western Approaches Command tell Konrad Helfrich what tactics the Germans were using to see if he could use the same tactics versus the Japanese, and vice versa? There was some sharing of tactics and discussion going on between the various theatres. However, they did also appreciate that a lot of what was going on was somewhat unique to each theatre. So, for example, in the Mediterranean, small, fast-diving submarines were critical. Large, long-range submarines that dived a bit slower were incredibly vulnerable. Conversely, out in the Atlantic, a small, fast-diving but short-range and short-endurance sub with not too many weapons was pretty useless. The larger the sub, generally the better, but you did want a kind of mid-size because of the viciousness of the convoy fights. And at least for a while, the Germans tried things like flak U-boats because of the air threat. In the Pacific, size and range were pretty much king above almost anything else, just because of the sheer size of the operational theatre. And so sharing tactics in terms of, oh, well, these U-boats or these submarines are doing this, we think this might work over in your area, on a very basic level, yeah, it would happen. But generally speaking, because, as I say, of the differences in theatres, not so much. Where a lot of tactics were shared, however, were in terms of anti-submarine warfare tactics, the other half of that equation, because the techniques used to attack submarines didn't vary too much. There were regional differences, as I say, like in the Mediterranean, you had to be a bit quicker off the mark because otherwise the sub was likely to have dived away, but conversely, you also perhaps more likely to spot a submarine travelling in shallower depths than you were in the Atlantic or the Pacific. Albeit, again, if you're in an island chain in the Pacific, there's again a much higher chance of you spotting a sub silhouetted against lighter seabeds than otherwise, but, you know, back and forth. But the anti-sub techniques, those were fairly widely distributed, especially because obviously the Atlantic was something of a cauldron of refinement of back and forth on anti-sub tactics. That would be passed to the Med and to the Pacific. Some stuff learned in the Med and the Pacific would be passed back, but generally it was usually Western Approaches Command that was developing some of the more advanced bits and pieces. But they'd take feedback on how things worked from across the board, and also they would feed some of their anti-sub tactics to Allied submarine commanders, because, you know, if they've figured out, as the Allies, this is a really good anti-sub tactic to use, then, well, people like the Watu unit could also, and regularly were, as much as the Germans or the Japanese or the Italians, figuring out counters to those tactics. So if you can feed to your own subs, right, well, this is a pretty advanced anti-sub tactic we've just come up with, also here's probably how you might survive, get out of it, then that means that if the enemy figures out something similar and tries to pull off against you, your sub has a much higher chance of making it home. So yes, there was a certain degree of interchange across all commands, but it was mostly about anti-sub tactics and how to evade them, as opposed to how to use your subs more generally in an attack role because, as I say, of the environmental differences. Bill Luster asks, the Admiralty seems to have planned to both upgrade existing faster ships like the Queen Elizabeth and the battle cruisers and build new ones for their aim for composite fleet in the 1940s. Did the US have similar pre-war plans to upgrade their old battleships or just replace them with new builds? The New Mexicos are listed as the most modernised US battleships circa 1941, but they don't seem as impressively upgraded as their Royal Navy peers. The US did have some pre-war plans to modernise and upgrade their old battleships, but it was partly a matter of timing and partly a matter of funding. So the British woke up to the idea of a potentially increasing threat in Europe somewhat earlier because obviously, well, Hitler kind of gave them a few telegraphed manoeuvres that said, maybe this whole treaty system probably isn't working out very well, as well as the Japanese skipping out on things. So the British rearmament program started a bit sooner, and therefore they could get some of their modernizations worked out sooner. Whereas in the US, although they were modernizing their fleet on a more, and obviously building new ships on a more general basis, and they knew that Japan would eventually become an issue, it wasn't as immediate an issue to them in the mid-1930s as Germany was. So there was a little bit of a delay there. Secondly, as you mentioned, the New Mexicos were the most modernised, but they compared to a QE or a Valiant or a Warspite or a Renown, they don't seem to be as heavily modernised, and that's basically because everyone was modernising their battleships several times during the interwar period. The Royal Navy had done it with the Revenge class as well as Barham and Malaya, and this kind of late 20s, early 30s upgrade cycle was what the New Mexicos had been through for the US Navy. But those were upgrade, modernisation, refits, not the near-complete rebuilds that you'd see in the mid to late 1930s. The US did have plans to do that. They were going to start with the Colorado class and then also do the Tennessees, the so-called Big Five. Everything else was going to get replaced by North Carolinas and South Dakotas, etc., as they came into service on a roughly linear age pattern. But precisely because of all of the issues I mentioned previously, it was just running a little bit late. The reason that USS Colorado missed Pearl Harbor was because she'd been put into dock literally days before, back in the continental United States, to begin a full makeover and modernization. That obviously was then accelerated, but because the rest of the US battleships that actually got sunk at Pearl Harbor, including things like her sister ship West Virginia, that and the war provided even more lessons in what you actually needed to do to fully modernize a battleship. It meant that Colorado came out of her modernization obviously early, with less experience and a bit rushed. So compared to something like USS West Virginia's rebuild, she doesn't look quite as impressive, but she would have looked a little bit more impressive had she not been modernized and rebuilt during the war period. And of course, something like West Virginia's rebuild probably more closely parallels what you might have got if, say, Rodney or Nelson had been rebuilt in the late war period for the UK. Dr. Irrelevant asks, the battle cruisers under Beatty took various measures to increase their rate of fire. These measures turned out to be quite dangerous and resulted in the destruction of Queen Mary, amongst others. My question is, did those actions actually increase their rate of fire? And if so, was it a significant increase? Were there safer ways of improving the rate of fire? To an extent, yes, they did. As far as it being a significant increase, well, in terms of being able to spit out rounds per minute, technically, yes. In terms of significant, as in actually made a blindest bit of difference to the outcome, not really. The ways that it was done, it basically centered around the fact that you could load a shell and its charges significantly faster, and obviously shoot them, than you could get those shells and charges to the guns, because the shells and charges obviously had to come up from the magazine, so you had to remove the shell and the charges, depending on which room you're in, from the magazine itself. You had to move them to where you would load them into the cages that would take them up. So there's a physical journey time involved, as well as the time it takes to actually get them off the shelf, effectively. Then they've got to be elevated up through all the various flash protection measures to the chamber underneath the turret, where they then have to be transferred to another set of lifting cages. They then have to be lifted again physically, so more transit time, up into the turret itself, and then you can finally get to the process of loading and firing the guns. So the other factor, of course, is the more you fire the guns, the deeper into the magazines the crew's having to go. So the more the fire is going on, the longer it's going to take to get the next shell and charger out, assuming, of course, you're firing as fast as humanly possible. So ways they got round it, depending on the ship, because it does seem to vary ship to ship. We know from certain accounts that some ships very definitely did have charges in their turrets. Whether or not each individual ship did, in terms of the ones that blew up, Invincible, Indefatigable, Queen Mary, Defense, I guess, as well. That is a very specific question, but we know for a fact from eyewitness accounts that some ships that survived the battle, like, ironically enough, considering just how spectacular it would have been if it had been hit Agincourt, were storing charges in the turrets. We know for absolute definite from Admiralty plans, when they increased the number of ready-use shells that were issued to the fleet, that shells were very definitely being stored outside of the magazines, with the diagrams of 13.5-inch turrets that show that in the working chamber directly below the gun turret itself. So you've got a layout that says, right, here's where you're storing these additional shells, because they wanted to go from 80 rounds per gun to 100 rounds per gun, or 100 rounds to 120 rounds per gun, depending on the ship in question. And there just wasn't the space in the magazines, because the magazines have been designed to the original spec, and so the gun house, well, directly below the turret was the working chamber, was the next place they thought to put them, because, well, it was still under the barbette armour, so hopefully that shouldn't go too wrong. And so those methods of increasing the rate of fire basically relied on cutting out some or all of the physical transit time from, deep in the ship to higher in the ship. If you've got cartridges right there and then in the turret, you just pick them up, sling them on, virtually no travel time. And if you've got shells in the chamber immediately below the turret, they've only got to go up the one short lift instead of two. So that'll help increase the rate of fire. Everything else in terms of keeping magazine doors open, possibly removing flash protection, things like this, all of that is because obviously each time one of those things has to open, it's a couple of seconds delay, and if you're being conscientious and you have everything in place, those few seconds add up every time to possibly 10 or more seconds overall delay in feeding the ammo to the gun. So you can see the obvious reason why you might try, if you're looking to increase rate of fire, why you might subordinate or potentially even completely compromise those measures. In terms of, was there safer ways of improving rate of fire? Well, I think the main question is, why would you want to? The whole idea was based around a somewhat erroneous assumption that if you just flung enough shells at the enemy, either something would hit or you'd get plenty of readings. So it's like, well, we shot there and that didn't hit, we shot there and that didn't hit, so therefore if we shoot here, we will hit. And obviously the more data points you get, the faster, then in theory, the better. That kind of missed the point that if the shells that you've just fired are still in flight, it doesn't actually help you all that much. You're still going to be correcting at about the same time you would be at a slower rate of fire. There was also an idea that if you smothered the enemy in near misses, even if they were near misses, you might sort of discombobulate them slightly, make it more difficult for them to see what they were doing, and therefore compromise their ability to hit you back until you corrected. About the only vaguely legitimate actual argument put forward was that once you actually had the range, then if you could deluge them in shells, you'd kill them fairly quickly. But that assumed you had to get the range in the first place, which, seems to be the major problem. But in terms of safer ways to actually improve your rate of fire, well, safer being the key word there, I think probably the only sustainably safe ways of doing it would involve considerable amounts of expense for a marginal increase in overall rate of fire. Specifically, the two things I can think of would be, one, more powerful machinery driving the cages that are lifting the shells and charges up and down, because obviously if they can travel faster, then that cuts down the travel time, cuts down the time to the shells actually getting to the guns. That might work, although again it's going to involve an awful lot of expense, an awful lot of very heavy over-engineered equipment, and if it breaks, then the results of the break could be a bit more spectacular. But yeah, that might shave a few seconds off of your overall load and fire time. The other thing would be increasing crew. Now, you can't increase crew infinitely because eventually they're going to start getting in each other's way. But if you had some more crew available to the magazines and maybe in the working chamber, then you can split the labour. So you can have multiple parties ready with shells and charges ready to move out. That reduces the travel time horizontally, people taking things from shelves to cages and so forth, on a per shell journey period. The crew is still going to be circulating, but the next one's ready to go rather than the crew has to run back and so on and so forth. And in aid of that, if you had some form of passive mechanical help like guidance rails, trolleys, etc., in addition to what they already had, then that, again, it might shave a few seconds off. So collectively, if you did both, you might shave 10, 12 seconds, maybe something like that, off of the journey time of shells and charges from magazine to gun, maybe a bit more. But that's going to involve an awful lot of expense, an awful lot of additional resources, especially if you're bumping the crew numbers up, because obviously that means you also need to carry more supplies, you need to have more accommodation space, more mess space, etc., 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 all for a benefit that only really comes in once you've established the range and started hitting somebody reliably in reality. And to be honest, once you've managed to accomplish that, they're probably dead anyway. You're just going through a massive amount of expense and risk to ensure they die just a fraction faster. And finally, Jonathan Smith asks, World War II electronic warfare. I know US carriers had homing beacons to help planes find their way back to the carriers, and I doubt they were the only navy with such a device. During World War II, did other nations ever spoof or jam these beacons in an attempt to cause aircraft to get lost and ditch or unable to find their way back to a friendly carrier? Alternatively, do you know of any instance where anyone was able to use direction finding on an enemy's homing beacon to help track down their carrier? In terms of spoofing or jamming, not that I'm particularly aware of anybody trying that. However, exploiting homing beacons and IFF systems definitely did happen. And that's actually something that's not really that much talked about and only recently come to light thanks to some very enterprising researchers who've dug right into a lot of details, both stuff that's just sequestered away in US archives that nobody's bothered to look at very much, and also things like Japanese war records. Now, when it came to British carriers, I've described before the kind of rotating pulse beacon that they used, which was pretty difficult to figure out because it was just a radio pulse beacon. You had to know the meaning of it to understand what it was doing and why, and even then it was pretty hard to, unless you're going to set up your own, it was pretty hard to do anything much about. So they didn't tend to suffer too much from it. However, in the latter part of the war, the Japanese actually made a surprisingly complex and intuitive system of exploiting the US carrier systems. Now, to a certain extent, that's because, they were in the war for a very long time in a naval environment, so exposure therapy, I guess, taught them quite a bit. But also, there were a lot of US carriers, so they had an awful lot of learning experiences that they could pick up on. So as a result, it's not necessarily that surprising that the Japanese figured out how to exploit the American systems to some degree. And it turns out there were a few ways that they did this. One of which was that the US IFF systems worked by being pulsed by a radar on a certain, or radio signal on a certain frequency, and then they would all say, yes, here I am, and they'd have various designators say, I'm a fighter, I'm a bomber, I'm a torpedo bomber, etc. Once the Japanese had their own radar technology, because obviously this wasn't exactly an encrypted, heavily encrypted transmission, it was just a frequency pulse, it was a pulse on a certain frequency, the Japanese figured out they could do this as well. And so in the late war, there's a fair amount of evidence that the Japanese were using their own radar equipment to pulse US Navy IFFs, so they could see where all the US Navy aircraft were as well. It obviously didn't do them all that much good, because just because you know where 500 carrier attack aircraft are as they come in to attack you, who has maybe like half a dozen zeros with a bunch of people you just pulled out of the flight academy, well, great, you know certain doom is coming and you can watch it coming on your little cathode ray display tube. Not a tremendous amount you can actually do about it, apart from maybe tell people to get to the bunkers a little bit faster. But when you think about a lot of the late war era carriers that got quite badly damaged, Franklin, Bunker Hill, Ticonderoga, even Enterprise at one point, you do see a disturbing number of attacks that appear to be done by lone aircraft, or ones and twos of aircraft. They're not and they're not the survivors of mass flight where it's like, the Japanese sent in 40 aircraft, one of them survived. Quite a lot of the time, not all the time obviously, but quite often, it's, we were sailing around quite happily, and then out of nowhere, random Japanese aircraft appeared. What on earth? Oh, it's bombed us. Well, that's inconvenient. Now we're all on fire. And it turns out that a lot of this was basically the Japanese using some of their few remaining good pilots and exploiting the fact that they could, to a certain extent, read the US IFF systems, and to a certain extent also imitate them a little bit, at least at longer ranges, to sneak through US air defenses. Because, if you're getting some signals, I think that's maybe possibly a friendly, it's not taking any particularly hostile action, and it's just one aircraft, surely no one's going to be insane enough to send one aircraft, and that one aircraft has been carefully course directed so that it's going to avoid visual recognition by any combat air patrols by going around them. Well, it's going to get lost in the clutter. And as I mentioned before, almost certain poor old Franklin got nailed by a weakness that meant that when you were spotting aircraft on the flight deck, US carriers couldn't use their radar pointing to port because it would trigger all the IFF systems in an endless cacophony on the flight deck. So that's a separate bit. So yeah, they did use electronic warfare, the Japanese, to help in their assaults on US carriers. And maybe at some point I'll do a video explaining that in a lot more detail. But yeah, that's kind of a broad coverage of the extent of some of their efforts. And that brings us to the end of another Dry Dock video. Now, there's a couple of bits of channel admin to go to this week. First, on the Battleship Guns video that was recently published, there were a few things that people pointed out, and a couple of legitimate points there, I think, that could be quite easily addressed. So, one, a bunch of people point out, well, if you're going to include the Deutschland class's 11-inch guns in the pre-1930s, you probably should include the Alaska class's 12-inch guns in the post-1930 environment. And, yeah, okay, fair point. My bad. I should do. I will incorporate that into the data. A few other people point out, well, maybe you shouldn't include either the Deutschlands or the Alaskas because they're cruisers, not battleships. And if you exclude the Scharnhorst 11-inch guns as well, then you can bring back in things like elevation and rate of train, because the slightly absurdly light weight of those guns then kind of isn't present to throw the calculations out wildly. However, whilst if it was just the Deutschlands and the Alaskas, I probably would go for it. The problem is the Scharnhorsts are battleships, fairly lightly armed battleships, but battleships nonetheless. So just arbitrarily excluding them, yeah, that doesn't quite sit right with me. So I'd rather include the Alaskas than exclude the Scharnhorst. So I'll be modifying the data set at some point, probably put it in a community post, the new resultant graph, and we'll see how that works out. Also, I will keep the pre and post 1930 graphs, but I'll also create a third graph, which is all of them all together, so you can see, I guess, compare the differences between the pre and post 1930 guns more directly. But the other thing that people pointed out is that using absolute range is, to an extent, a function of the turret more than a function of the gun. And when I was creating the data set, as I mentioned in the video, I was a little bit torn over it precisely for that reason, that it does have a certain amount of bearing on it. But a few of you quite rightly pointed out that, absolute range is, to more or less an extent, a function of how far will the turret let the elevation go, rather than the capability of the gun per se. But if you used a value such as how much range does the gun have at 20 degrees of elevation, which near enough everybody's guns could do, that will probably give a much better idea of the relative capabilities of the gun, because they're all now at a fixed elevation, but the gun that can shoot further and the shell that can travel longer will obviously get a higher score at that elevation than a shell and gun combo that is particularly weak and therefore will fall short. So I will be modifying the range value in this revised data set to take into account range at 20 degrees elevation. Hopefully all the data will be there for that, but we shall see. So there's those two issues factoring in. So well done, people. You caught one omission, not deliberate, but you caught it anyway, and suggested also an improvement. So we'll go with those, see what that data set spits out when I get the chance to actually revise it, because over the next week or so I've got to record the Patreon Mega Dry Dock, so it's probably not going to happen this week. Anyway, that's one bit. The other bit is a few people have emailed me to ask, can we meet up when I'm on the US trip in April? The short answer is yes, that's perfectly fine. I don't have any objection to that. But a few others also pointed out I should probably have some way of managing this, because who knows how many of you are going to show up to different places. And again, this is a fair point. Also, as yet another couple of people pointed out, probably on the days where I've decided I want to chill out and rest. No offense, but chill out and rest means just that. So I'm not entirely sure on how to manage it, but I think managing it is a good idea. So I'm going to open the floor to people for suggestions. Probably I'd suggest dropping me the suggestions via email or via Discord messages rather than in the comments, because there's a lot of comments per video, and I might not see a specific idea that way. What's been floated, the thing is, I'm somewhat sensitive about the fact I don't want your personal data. Yeah, I wouldn't do anything with it anyway, but I also don't want to just have it, because I'd probably a fool's foul of some regulation or law somewhere anyway. But one of the things that kind of is appealing to me at the moment would be to use something like a free ticketing service like Eventbrite. So I could then put in, something like Drac visits USS Constitution. I can then put in the day that I'm at the USS Constitution and the location, which might be helpful for some people. And then also a time window, i.e. I will be on the Constitution and happy to meet people between X and Y time. And then obviously I can put the time in such a way that, for example, I say if I put the time as from 1 o'clock to 5, then that means I have the morning to, unless people just randomly show up anyway, which I guess you could, but I would then have the morning in theory to do my filming and bits to camera on the ship, and then from 1 o'clock people can come and say hi, and then it doesn't matter at that point that I can't do sort of filming and such, because I've already got it done. It's built into the schedule. And obviously, you don't have to say who you are in filling in one of those, let's say an Eventbrite type thing. You can just call yourself, Jim Bob the Third, if you like. I don't really care that much. As I say, it's more a case of just knowing roughly how many people are going to be showing up. And obviously also there is another factor, which is that obviously I'm going to be on these museum ships, so I'm sure the museum ships would probably appreciate knowing potentially how many extra visitors might show up, or yeah, I mean, I'd have to check with the museum ships management if they're happy for people to meet up on the ships as well, which is another thing, because if for whatever reason, health and safety, COVID, whatever, a museum ship says, well, actually, we'd rather not have a dozen or more people all congregating on the quarterdeck at once, then I might have to adjust the time and location for somewhere like, a park or a restaurant or the seafront or something like that nearby. And then obviously we make sure we're not ticking off the poor old museum ship managers, and we all get to have a chat and say hi. So that seems like a good idea to me. But let me know if you think it's a bad idea, and if so, why. If you think it's a good idea, or if you have an alternative idea that might work better. And of course, I'm not saying you absolutely have to. If we go with that system or some other system, I'm not saying you have to fill it in. It would just be handy. So, if I'm looking, I'm going, oh, okay, about a dozen people are expecting to see me at that ship. Great, fine, I can anticipate that. Whereas, if I'm going to a ship thinking, oh, great, I'm going to be all on my own or with my small crew for the whole day, and I turn up and I don't know, if I'm going to be extremely optimistic, suddenly there's like 100 people waiting. I was like, okay, what am I doing now? Help. Who knows what could happen. But yeah, say if you don't want to use any system and you just want to show up on the day, well, the schedule will be published and you're perfectly welcome to do so. I've got no objection to that either. It is obviously, as they say, a free country. But once all of that is worked out, once I've got my ESTA visa and Mrs. Drack, etc., also have their ESTA visas, sorted out the RV rentals and flight tickets, everything, so I actually know this thing is 100% going ahead, because how many times have I tried to get this thing off the ground in the past year and a bit? Anyway, 2 years actually now. Yeah. But once it's all absolutely definitely going ahead and everything is locked in, and I know what requirements the various museum ships might want of me, then I'll be putting up a very detailed schedule and links and all of that kind of thing on my website, drakkinifel.co.uk, and I'll be linking that in the video description of whatever video is relevantly live at that point. So you can all go and have a look then and, figure out what you want to do. If at all, if anything. And heck, if you want to show up and just throw things at me, then okay, feel free, but please just make sure they don't smell too badly and they're not travelling at too high a velocity with too much kinetic energy. Rotten fruit, as long as it's not a tomato, that's probably fine. Marshmallows, very welcome. I might even be lucky enough to grab one. Thrown rocks, probably less welcome. Unless it's rock candy, that would be very welcome. Anyway, I'm going to shut up now and let you go back to your regular daily lives. Thank you very much for listening.